Good morning, everybody. Very happy to be here, and hopefully we will have some very productive and engaging discussion throughout the rest of the day. All right, so the question that I was asked to address was when are impact evaluation appropriate and feasible? As you can see from the first slide, we get some pictures of some interventions, and then sometimes there's a kind of they hope that we're going to create an impact, and that kind of drop in the ocean is actually going to have some multiple effects down the road. So there's a few initial remarks I would like to make before we go into the presentation. So impact evaluation represents only one of the different types of evaluations that you could do, in the international development. So this is the first thing. Then impact evaluation definitions vary. We've already seen that among the participants here, there's not necessarily a consensus and agreement over the definition of impact evaluation. OECD DAC, for example, I just wrote it down because I always forget, defines the impact as the positive and negative, the primary and secondary long-term effects. They were produced either directly or indirectly by an intervention, and they were either intended or unintended. So it's a very broad definition that doesn't really tell you anything about the method. It doesn't mention any causality, any counterfactual. And then we have a USID, or you have the randomistas movement. So they always talk about impact evaluation in association with very statistical, rigorous methods. And so this is where we start venturing into the zone of the economists, and we start talking about counterfactuals and statistical techniques, etc. There's a disagreement, of course, over the most adequate designs and methods to be used in impact evaluation, and my wish will be covering that. And then the paradox is that impact evaluations at times are feasible and are appropriate, but the questions are not very relevant or not very useful. So the fact that you kind of comply with those technical requirements for being appropriate or for being feasible doesn't mean that there's actually going to be a use of the impact evaluation findings. So most of the slides are actually about when impact evaluation appropriate, and I'm pretty sure that some of the points will resonate with you, so I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Well, first of all, why should we go for an impact evaluation? Because first, we have a need for real information that we have not at our disposal yet, either through monitoring or some very small studies, more or less sporadic, that might have been conducted throughout the implementation process. So normally when we talk about impact evaluation, these are some of the examples. We want to verify that the hypothesis on which our intervention is being based actually holds or not. In the case of a pilot project or a project that's never been tested before or whose logic has never been tested before, an impact evaluation is very appropriate, would definitely be appropriate. Sometimes we just want to see whether the combination of different activities or the different dosages of interventions have several and different results or different impacts on the targeted population. So these are some of the examples. So a real need for information is the first. Then, of course, you need to make sure that the time between the baseline and the follow-up, provided that you're planning as part of your evaluation to have a baseline and a follow-up, and that time that elapses between these two data collection phases is sufficiently long. It doesn't need to be 4 or 5 years. I think the myth is that you can only do impact evaluation when the intervention has been underway for almost 5 years. Let's think about a pilot project, a small pilot project. You don't need to wait 3 or 4 years. Sometimes a pilot project will last for 6 months, for 3 months, for 4 months. So it really depends on the outcome of interest. It really depends on the behavioral change, if that's the case, of the immediate effect that you're actually expecting your interventions to produce. And then this is an old argument, it's the ethical argument. It's definitely not appropriate where for the sake of comparing what happened within your intervention with what happened outside of the interventions, you deny goods and services to the comparison group or the control group. And then you want to make sure that when you have an impact evaluation, there's some kind of data quality review that is being done throughout the implementation, throughout the conduct of the evaluation. It's really easy to say that as a result of an impact evaluation, there's been an incredible effect of a very large magnitude, and you can just use your statistical jargon and talk about effect sizes and all of that. But if the quality of the data that has actually been sustain that inference on the success of your project is not good, then the whole findings and the whole impact evaluation conclusions will definitely be questionable. Sometimes, especially when we go for randomization, we do not capture those groups within a broader population. They're actually the neediest or the ones that we're particularly interested in. If we, for example, randomize from within a certain population and we did not really qualify what that population of interest is, we might have a street children project and then as a result of a randomization get a lot of people who are not children in our sample. Or, we could work with women that are not necessarily sex workers. And your impact evaluation is supposed to actually look at the results of an intervention, maybe an awareness raising campaign or like on condom distribution among sex workers in any given community. So you really need to qualify. I'm going to talk about the qualification and the definition and specification of your intervention, but also of your population of interest. You need to make sure that you have a communication and a dissemination strategy. We're very used to actually disseminating the findings of an evaluation after the evaluation has been conducted. And there's not much of an effort has been done since day zero, I would say, on getting stakeholders around you. You need to get allies and you need to get supporters for your impact evaluation, especially when the impact evaluation will take a pretty long time and it's addressing questions that are pretty controversial. So communication and a dissemination strategy that should always be in place, since the beginning of an impact evaluation endeavor. This is probably one of the thorniest issue right now within the evaluation community. A lot of people are accusing the economists and the people who really support hyper-quantitative, I should say, impact evaluation designs as insufficient and not capable of capturing the complexity and the complicated reality and messy reality that we're dealing with. And so there's a part of the evaluators within the community that are saying impact evaluation doesn't lend itself to actually addressing questions that are too complex and too difficult and too broad. You need to be very specific, you need to qualify and specify your intervention, and from within your intervention you should be able to, I always say, dissect your intervention. You should dissect your intervention and identify a very clear activity with a very clear effect or outcome of interest that is more or less directly affiliated with it. Of course, you have data collection done at the very beginning, at the very end, and maybe throughout the implementation. You're not going to have an impact evaluation systematically conducted or data collection on a daily basis. And sometimes what I've seen working with clients is that monitoring data have not been used adequately, and have not been maximized. So sometimes, which is not justified unless your monitoring data is not very good, I see impact evaluation that address questions that are easily answerable through monitoring data. At the same time, the monitoring data is really telling us what's happening, in the course of our intervention. I will give you an example. Let's say that we have a school feeding program, and as a result of my impact evaluation, I just make this great statement that the project has been very successful. Attendance rate has increased. The nutritional status of people in the program has actually increased a lot compared with the day or the month before the intervention started. Well, as a result of this statement, some people, if I was a founder or if I was a manager, I would say, why don't we replicate it? Why don't we scale it up? But then what happens if we find out through monitoring data that actually the intervention was not implemented the way he was designed? Maybe the implementing partner was very creative, much more creative than you and your team, and it was that new creative strategy or different or deviated to a certain extent implementation strategy that is the success and contributed to the success of their intervention. So in evaluation we talk a lot about the black box. So what happens in between the baseline and the follow-up. 2 years, 3 years go by. So I'm more of a country person, a field person. I always try to be in countries, and it is actually in countries in the field that I make the most amazing discoveries, and especially with impact evaluation. I'm thinking of one of the many designs is that you could use impact evaluation is regression discontinuity. Regression discontinuity forces implementers to actually give a service or a certain good to a certain group of people based on a score. So if you as an eligible participant don't qualify or you're below or above the score of 50, let's say on an index that you use for impact evaluation purposes, that you shouldn't be gain access to those services, to those goods. Whenever I go to the country, I always find out that the NGOs at times give the services to no matter who, or sometimes they deny the services to people that were eligible to receive those goods and services. So especially when we talk about when we start venturing the impact evaluation, a highly statistical zone, you need to make sure that the operational manual, if there's an operational manual for your intervention, is duly complied with. Well, this, I know that there's going to be a presentation of threats to validity. It's more of a generic recommendation. You cannot have an impact evaluation if you don't make sure that all those biases, selection bias, and threats to internal and external validity have been adequately addressed. If some of you are not necessarily familiar with this terminology, you shouldn't be scared, because I think there's going to be a session later on in the afternoon directly concerned with these issues. Triangulation. Yes, so what is triangulation? The use actually of data coming from multiple resources to address, for example, the same evaluation question. I think it's very appropriate, like any other evaluation. Some of you might say this is kind of a recommendation that applies to all kinds of evaluation, is not just impact evaluation. Triangulation definitely makes and strengthens the robustness of the findings and the validity of and the credibility eventually of your impact evaluation findings. Some people might say you need to have a baseline data collection and at the very beginning of your intervention, and then you expect the intervention to go in a certain way, and you're actually testing that intervention and that causal link the way you originally designed it. But in reality, things in the field don't always happen the way we originally designed them. So what are we going to do when your impact evaluation strategy, or the foundations of your strategy, are so rigid? But in the field, you need to be very flexible. You need to make corrective actions. So there are the detractors, so to speak, of the RCT, the randomized control trial movement, which I also refer to as the movement of randomistas, are always claiming that impact evaluation should never be applied to interventions that since the beginning of the intervention itself, that they might not go the way they're supposed to, or they might deviate throughout the implementation process. So if you're one of those people that is saying, we're going to implement a certain intervention, we don't really know what's going to happen, I think we need to be flexible enough to make corrective actions throughout implementation, just be very aware that those implementation adjustments will have huge implications for your impact evaluations. It will be very costly at times to restart data collection or to start asking new questions for which you have no baseline since the beginning. And of course, you need to qualify the context and environmental factors that actually surround the intervention itself. And this is pretty much for replicability purposes. It's very scary when I see evaluators that worked in Asia or Latin America, and then they show up, at their client's office with findings of evaluation for that specific area, but they are finding themselves in a totally different continent now. So the external validity, the replicability of the inferences, of the findings of an evaluation really depends on how good you've been at addressing these external validity threats and actually qualifying the time, the type of population that you work with, the place, etc. Of course, there are some exceptions to this idea that you cannot use impact evaluation where your implementation strategy deviates. For example, there was this conditional cash transfer program in Colombia called Familias en Acción, and the families that were targeted by these interventions were not supposed to get any cash transfers or any payment before the intervention started. But since the implementation took a very long time the impact evaluation took a very long time to set up and eventually conduct, what happened was that before the baseline was conducted, those families had already started receiving some payments. And so creatively, what do you do in that case? You don't go for the impact evaluation? No. What you do is you kind of qualify when you do your analysis and your data collection. You ask the questions, how many payments have you received already? And so eventually the comparison was across households from that program over time that had as a baseline 1, 2, or 3 payments provided to them as opposed to 0 payment. Of course, you need to have sufficient time available for the use of findings. Sometimes we have a year and a half, and we need to make a decision. And it could be we need to satisfy certain requirements of the curiosity of a funder, of a donor. Well, in that case, if you have a year and a half, and you know that it takes about 2.5 years to see any effect of the direct or indirect result of your intervention, then impact evaluation, this whole idea of causality or attribution, might not be the most appropriate way to address your question. So you might want to explore like alternative venues. There's no point in conducting an impact evaluation at times when you know that, for example, you have a vaccination program. You know that if you vaccinate children, in most cases, if not 100% of cases that people from UNICEF would say, your immunization rate will go up, and then the incidence of a certain disease will go down. So do we need an impact evaluation for a vaccination program when the causal link between vaccination and reduction in let's say measles incidence is pretty much being tested, and you pretty much know that there's no other intervention in the community that could actually contribute to that same effect. So this is at times it could be a controversial statement, and some people, I would like to hear from you guys what you think. So this is a feasibility of impact evaluation. So we're addressing the second question. This is not a surprise. You need money and technical expertise, and in most cases, and there is a point that could be debated. Do we need somebody from the outside to conduct an impact evaluation? Well, unless sometimes out of necessity you have to, just because you don't have the technical expertise in house, and of course, then the money. There's also the time issue. When you have created sufficient support for local and national authorities, I don't know how many of you guys have actually been randomizing as part of your impact evaluation, but I spend at least 2 weeks in the field, if not more, trying to actually, as a diplomat, to go to all the different governmental agencies and ministries to get support, to get not just data on what's already on the ground, but to get the support for randomizing. And you need to make sure that when you promote your impact evaluation or your randomization, you make sure that the information on the impact evaluation itself, it doesn't necessarily get disseminated with everybody right away, because if you find out as control or comparison that you're not receiving goods and you're not receiving a certain service, you might actually, and I think that's one of the risks, so you could actually sabotage, or you can have people in the community sabotage your activity and your impact evaluation. You need to make sure that the implementing partners know how to implement the project in the first place, because I told you already that sometimes the implementation is not listed on the ground. It's not what I was told it would be based on the operations manual. And if I design with you an impact evaluation, very likely I will ask certain questions, and I will provide for data collection at certain times of the year based on what the timeline of the schedule of the intervention itself is. But if we find out that later on the operation manuals are not being followed, are we kidding ourselves? Who are we fooling? Are we really testing the impact evaluation or the impact of this intervention, or are we actually testing the impact of an intervention that does not exist and is just in our minds and it's just a fantasy? Then you need to have a baseline. Of course, you have the pre and post, or what happened before, what happens afterwards. Then we could say also with and without, what happens within those people that receive the interventions and those people who do not receive the intervention. You can reconstruct a baseline. Some people might say this is not a rigorous impact evaluation, and I think this is an interesting issue. So we can talk about impact evaluation. It doesn't necessarily that it needs to be an RCT. And it's just the statistical rigor of your impact evaluation will be quite different. But I think that an impact evaluation in and of itself still has the dignity of being considered an impact evaluation, as long as you qualify how you actually were able to collect the data and what kind of data your findings are based. And I'm almost done. Yeah, this is, I already discussed it. I'm sure that, you're familiar with the idea of a logic model, but here we talk so much about the theory of change. It's really hard to dissect your intervention and to identify a specific activity and a specific effect connected to that activity if you don't have a good theory of change in the first place. It could be that you have no theory of change to start with, in which case you would reconstruct it. And most of the time, I would say 50% of the time, if not even more, I reconstructed the theory of change with the client, with the people around the table, with the old team, and sometimes it could actually be a very lengthy process. So just be very wary of people that say, I did an impact evaluation of my multi-component project or program. I would be very scared because listen, this is my understanding. I would be interested to also see what my wish and the rest of the audience has to say on that. You cannot do an impact evaluation of a program, especially when you have a program that is made up of different activities and different components. You need to specify the activity, and causality needs to be it's grounded on the identification of the very specific aspects of your program, and not just general pin direct flight kind of assessments. Yeah, of course, when you have like a larger communication program, especially in governance. I was recently in Ukraine, and they were asking me, how are we going to do an impact evaluation on an RCT of a program that has been distributing information on free media across the country using all the means of communication available within the country. I said, well, it would be really hard for you to identify a comparison group in this case, because the whole population has been exposed to the intervention itself. So there are cases where it's just not feasible because of the universal features, so to speak, of the intervention. And then the last one, and sometimes you cannot just randomize. You cannot just say, well, I'm going to build a bridge here and I'm not going to build it here just for the sake of defending the statistical rigor of what I do or what we do. So sometimes just the nature of the intervention itself doesn't lend itself to randomization, provided that your concept and definition of impact evaluation is a randomized controlled trial or highly statistical and mostly quantitative endeavor. So I know that there's a lot of thoughts, and it's probably a very stressful way to start the morning with all this idea about when an impact evaluation are feasible and appropriate. But hopefully most of the points that are here make sense to you guys, and I would love to hear also from my wish, Carlisle, and the rest of you on comments and further questions you might have.
Thank you, Michele.